And now it's my honor to introduce Chris Shelton, the president of AES Energy Storage and former chair of ESA. As president of AES Energy Storage, Chris leads the AES Corporation business unit with 200 megawatts of advanced energy storage resources in operation and construction, and another 1,000 megawatts in development. That's impressive. He has over 15 years of technology-related development and systems architecture experience, and has been a leader in the origination of new business efforts at AES. These efforts include the launch of a retail electricity business, where he pioneered the bundling of environmental offsets with customer electricity consumption, and he began the first AES wind development efforts. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics. Please welcome Chris Shelton. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good morning to the last day of a great event, and I congratulate as well all the new board members and thank all the outgoing board members. You're joining me on the other side of the ESA board. It's a little more relaxing at these events when you're not on the board, so you're back in that position, and it's good to be back there myself and to be able to spend more time focusing on the event. As a participant, not only as someone with an official duty. So today I wanted to speak a little bit about storage at a very high level, as high level as we can keep it. Because as we've worked in storage at AES, and we now have 200 megawatts in operation and construction, we, as I sometimes say to my team, our team at AES, we live in an undiscovered country. We're in a place where we're using this technology on the grid, and things become more real over time. As you do more of this, it really sinks in what the capabilities of this technology category are and what they could really mean for the grid overall. The speed and accuracy of performance is everything everyone talks about at these events. It definitely is there. That's how it functions. The reliability is there. This technology, the underlying technology in the battery realm that we're working in, for sure, is incredibly resilient and reliable. It's a great addition to the already reliable things we have on the grid. But it's, as I said, it's speed and accuracy, that precision of performance is stellar, and we're seeing that in PJM. And if you haven't seen the PJM Market Monitor report on how the pay-for-performance market there is working and what it's doing for the 60 million consumers in the PJM region in terms of their cost of ancillary services, please go find it and take a look, because it's showing that because of that accuracy and precision, PJM can procure less of the traditional resources that it was procuring. And so overall it's procuring less, and even though it's procuring the storage and it's paying more now per unit of performance, it's actually the overall cost for regulation per unit of energy delivered to the consumers in that region is the lowest it's been. So they're seeing a cost savings for that market that's significant. And what that represents is an alternative to the traditional way of doing it. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on more as we look at the industry. Storage, as Colette said, is not going to replace generation, certainly not going to replace transmission or distribution either. But it may, given that those are the three dominant categories of technology in the industry, it probably will replace parts of all of them. And that's what we really need to think about. And the reason that storage will do that is whenever you implement storage in a distribution system, it optimizes the constrained resources. So within that system, you're going to optimize the use of any given resource. And historically, the way we did that was overbuilding. So now that storage is being introduced, we have an opportunity to overbuild less on the electric system. And to turn that around, that just makes storage an alternative to a lot of our other investment decisions. And that's good news for all of us who want to serve the world, make it a better place, and do business in the process, because that means we have a market. So that's the high level of, I think, what we need to look at today. I'm not going to talk about distributed versus centralized, and I'm not going to talk about technology, and I'm not going to talk about cost. We don't need to talk about that anymore, I don't think. We've hit those topics quite a bit. So I've tried to think about what could we focus on here today that is built on the foundation of those other things developing as we all expect that they will. So before I get into this a little bit, I wanted to do a little bit of an exercise in the room and tell you a little bit of a story of what happened to me about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago now. How many of you have had a power outage in the last 2 years? Rough polling, I would say half of the room. So raise your hand again and keep it up. How many of those were a day in length or longer? So it's about 10%. How many were 2 days? Same length. Once it's more than an hour, I guess it's 2 days. So keep 3 days, 4 days, right? So some of you must live around New York or in New Jersey or somewhere, right? So yeah, 5 days. I'll just keep going. 6 days. If you're not looking around, there are people with their hands still up. 7 days. 8. I'm going to stop at 10. 9. Okay. So when you think about that, it really makes you think, you know, when that happens, when power is off for more than 24 hours, you really start to think about how important electricity is to you. And in my case, it was last summer. We go to the Outer Banks every year for vacation, and it's a spectacular place, but don't join us there because there's never anyone there. You know, it's pretty quiet. So we get up early in the morning to go, but the night before there was a horrible storm came through, and when we woke up, it was like the apocalypse. I mean, there were trees falling everywhere. The power was already off, so we're getting ready to go to the beach, and the power's off. We're loading the car. It's dark. We've got flashlights out and everything. And it was like Escape from DC. We're like, we're getting out of here. And we were going to have the dog sitter check on the house later. As we're going, trees are literally falling behind us. We're dodging trees the whole way down to the Outer Banks. And when we're there, we call the dog sitter. They come and check. Power's off. Sorry. You know, next day, power's still off. So thankfully, I was at the beach, and I was very grateful to be at a place with electricity, hoping a hurricane wasn't coming while I was there. And 5 days later, the power was still off. It took 5 days for the power to come back. But the whole time, I'm checking on my iPhone. I'm looking at I have a Nest thermostat, so I'm using that as my sort of outage detection system. Is the Nest back alive yet? So, but in that setting, you really appreciate our electrical infrastructure. And interesting story to kind of wrap that up that I think is some of us may have experienced. A guy who works with me, Brett Galora, he's here. Some of you may have met him this week. He bought a little 2-kilowatt generator. His power didn't go off the next time the power went off. It went off that first time, but he bought the generator, and then his power didn't go off the second time. And, but my power did go off again 3 weeks later for 2 days. So in the same year, I had a 5-day outage and a 2-day outage. I went to his house to get his generator because his power wasn't off. And I brought it home, I set it on the deck. My wife's like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" I said, "We don't know when the power's coming back on. It was off 5 days the last time." And I set the generator on the deck, the lights miraculously come on. I didn't have to plug it in, you know. It's like snow blowers. There's some like inverse law of, you know, Murphy's Law or something. If you have those two things, nothing goes wrong. So if your friend has a generator, don't go buy one. Just go ask your friend if you can bring it to your house and the lights come on. You don't have to plug it in. It's very safe too. I didn't have to run extension cords all over the house. So, but that is a way for us to kind of think about how important the electric grid is. I was at a conference earlier this week where one of the speakers was pointing out there are 18, you know, there was a study, there are 18 critical infrastructures. All 17 of the other ones depend on electricity, right? We all know that. But this system is facing some challenges, right? We have the retirements we've talked about. We have bad actors shooting at transformers, all the things that people talk about in terms of context for the grid. We have Mother Nature, as we just talked about, but we also have aspirations, right? We want economic growth. We want unlimited addition of renewable energy, a clean system. Internationally, we're talking about access to electricity for the developing world. Those are all very important things. They're challenges that we all have in the electric system, in the electric sector. And yesterday, I mentioned the privilege that we have to work on electricity because it really does improve lives. We know that. And your life, you get the inverse of the reverse of improvement when your power's off for 5 days. You really appreciate it. Incidentally, when the power's off for 5 days, what do? You pull out your iPad because it has a battery in it. It works really well when the power's off. So we see how storage gets introduced to deliver services to us with electricity in those times when the power's off. And that's how really the internet and the telecom system keep running. They have battery backup systems. But the electric system, which is the foundation of all of those other ones, could have some of that too, right? So that's really why we're all here. That's why we're all excited. So I think the real question is, you know, can storage transform the electricity system into an unbreakable, clean foundation of our society? And I think it really can. And the exciting thing, as I mentioned before, is that it can do it as an alternative to a lot of the other things that we're planning to spend money on anyway. So this is not going to be a bolt-on. We don't have to make it an add-on to our total spend for this infrastructure. It can be embedded into the planning that we're already doing, and we can choose it as an alternative. And again, as I said, I'm not talking central or distributed. I'm not talking about technology. I'm not talking about policy. I'm talking at a very high level, at really just at a system design, economics thinking level. This really can happen, and the technology is there, and it can happen, I think, in the next decade. And I'll show you some numbers that I think allow this to happen. And I'll finish with a number that shows, I think, it can really be meaningful to the overall system. And I'm going to use the US as the example because we have a lot of data about that from EIA and other places, but I'm not intentionally only focusing on the US. And AES is, works in over 20 countries. So we definitely believe in, developing and working in those other markets. So as I said before, we have this real stuff in service in markets. This is one of our facilities in PJM, and it's a 40 megawatt resource, and it's an alternative to what the thing behind it can do in some cases, right? The thing behind it is a combustion turbine that's owned by our company as well, right there in Dayton. So we've also talked about and shared that we're doing larger things built on the foundation of the previous photo at AES. We now have a comprehensive, true alternative to power generation, and we are focused on the central part of the grid at our company. Many of you are focused on all the different pieces of the grid, and storage, I believe, will be embedded throughout in the end, eventually as we adopt it. So we call this Advancion, the overall solution, and it's technology agnostic and can scale to the needs that we have at that central grid scale. I'll point out also that when we talk about storage, we use two designations. We use the resource designation, which in this case would be 600 megawatts, because all storage is a dual resource. It's a supply resource and a load resource. And so those get combined when we're talking about the value of the thing that we're offering the electric system is its combined resource capability. It's load side resource and its supply side resource. And the demand response industry is built on the fact that a load is a resource. We have the pure form of a controllable load resource, especially in the central grid systems. They're grid dedicated resources that are digitally controllable. So it's the pure form of a controllable load. And so we should not hide it, as we have done historically in the industry. We will also maintain, for clarity, that you could call this a 300 megawatt interconnection system. That's the size of the interconnection. There's a subtle, interesting outcome of using these two designations, and that is storage is twice as interconnection efficient as generation, because you get two resources on one interconnection. So if you needed 2,000 megawatts of flexibility, if all of it was generation, you would need 2,000 megawatts, actually more, of interconnection. In this case, you would only need half of that. So if you needed 2,000 megawatts, you could do it with 1,000 megawatts of interconnection if you were using storage. So moving on to some of those contextual things that we're dealing with and how they turn into numbers. And then also the question of, can this really be meaningful? So as we talk to people, we share the facts of what's happening. We share things like the market monitor analysis of what's happening in PJM, the analysis of what we've been doing in Chile with people. And without a doubt, every single time we get a question about cost, and we get a question about meaningful impact. How big can this really be? So of all the topics we could talk about today, that's the one I want to address and put it in the context of what's happening in the US, which is one of the largest markets in the world. I think it's dancing back and forth with China in terms of largest. So cumulative capacity figures, and this is all different kinds of buckets on the same graph, okay? It's not an engineering graph. It's just meant to show relative size. We talked about retirements. So if you look at the EIA data, all retirements of all categories, this isn't just coal or any other type of category, is 82,000 megawatts in the next 10 years. So in the next 10 years, we're going to retire 82,000 megawatts. It's basically putting a number on what Jim Rogers was talking about, right? So he was saying, we've got a lot of retirements. All sources are going to have retirements. and that's just a natural process. A lot of this infrastructure was built 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It's just naturally going to retire out. This would include nukes, oil units, coal units, some renewables, older, the very first generation wind is in there. That's the magnitude we're talking about in the next 10 years. And so even though we don't have load growth, we still have all of this natural turnover. EIA also predicts that in that context of all of those retirements, we will have an expected addition of 30,000 megawatts of peakers or combustion turbine equipment. And this is relevant here because if we want to be an alternative to something on the generation side, which is where we're working, this is a great place to start because these are assets that we spend over the last 12 years. We spent on average about $5 billion a year on average on this type of technology, and it has about a 6.5% capacity factor. The facility I showed you in the picture earlier has, I think it's less than 2% capacity factor. So it's there, it's serving a purpose. I'm not saying it's not valuable to the system, but it's not utilized very often. So if we can make trade-offs between our investments and say, how much of our investment do we want to be something we can use every day versus something that really is an insurance policy that we're only going to use 1% of the time. And this is the bucket I think we need to look at and mine. And really, it's not us, it's the state utility commissions in particular who have the opportunity to challenge the inquiry into what storage can really do in their states. And California has done that, and it's setting a model for one way to do that. New York is doing that as well, and several other states are looking at it. So that's an exciting development really in the last 2 years that we've seen that shows that people are saying, let's compete storage against some of these other things that we're buying. That really puts it in the alternative context rather than a bolt-on. So in that same time frame, EIA has 28,000 megawatts of new renewables, and this is all category renewables, but it's like 80% wind and solar in that category. So can storage have a meaningful impact in the next 10 years in this context? So one way to look at that is, what's the existing sort of the existing plus expected supply chain that could service this? And the lithium-ion battery supply chain is kind of one of the most dominant new technology supply chains that could come in. Incidentally, I should have put this on here, but in the interest of keeping it as simple as possible, I didn't. The amount of additional pumped storage in the EIA's forecast is none. It stays the same. It's been 20,000 something forever. It's going to be 20,000 into the future forever, 20,000 megawatts. So it may be a little bit more than that. It might be another couple projects get done in that time frame. But some of those projects take 10 years to develop. So it may take a long time to add additional in that category. So looking at lithium-ion battery supply chain, if you take a recent Navigant analysis on this, and they predict out through this time frame, and you just take the manufacturing capability that's planned, this is sort of committed and planned manufacturing capability for lithium-ion for all the major suppliers, and you do a cumulative addition, just add up all of the electric vehicle production and all of the grid targeted. So there's sort of, there are all these buckets, consumer and other things. If you only look at vehicle, which is grid applicable, and grid targeted, and you just add all of those up, you end up with 130,000 megawatts of 4-hour batteries. So if we take the total gigawatt hours of production expected over the next 10 years of transportation targeted and grid targeted, storage, which I think are the same thing. That's just the way Navigant made that designation. You make 4-hour battery systems out of that capability. So you divide the number of gigawatt hours by 4, you end up with 130,000 megawatts of capability in 10 years. So the question of can this be meaningful should be clearly answered by these numbers. And this leaves out any breakthrough addition that comes in the next 5 years that could participate in this at scale, of which there are, probably 30 or 40 things people are working on that could gestate in the next 3 to 5 years that could come in and serve in this as well. So this also doesn't talk about compressed air or any other technology that could serve in this context. So I think that's meaningful. It's important. We talk about it internally because it motivates our response when people ask us, can this be meaningful? And it motivates us internally that we really can accomplish something for the overall electric system that can be, transformative. So what if we take that context and say, over that period, we get excited about storage as an industry, we get a lot of movement, and we start choosing it as an alternative over that period, and we introduce it into the system, I think we end up with what I was saying before is an unbreakable clean grid, because if you look at the total expected capacity in 2023, and this doesn't change much over that time, it fluctuates between 900,000 megawatts today in the US, 950, goes to 1 million. And basically in that time frame it hovers around this level in the US. If you take 50,000 megawatts of storage, and I'm going to consider that inverter-based storage. Well, we said earlier that, and I'm saying 50,000 megawatts interconnected because that's what all those other numbers were. But if I take its full resource value, it actually would be 100,000 megawatts of resource, of controllable, flexible power resource. If I do that, I end up with 100,000 megawatts of swing. And if I do it with inverters, I can do all of that swing in less than a second. So I could do 100,000 megawatts in 1 second on the grid. In that environment, things probably change a little bit. The time dependency that we have in our electricity system, the hourly pricing and the scheduling and all the focus we have on that probably can be diminished a little bit if we know, because we've built the infrastructure, that we can flex the system 100,000 megawatts in a second. And if we do that with 4-hour type systems, as I showed before, we could do that for hours at a time. So we could flex 100,000 megawatts for an hour or 2 hours in either direction, as needed, at will. That's essentially a buffer. Almost all systems have that. So we're not making a new thing. This isn't a unicorn. This is just like a buffering system for any distribution system that you have. Almost all other ones have it. That's the way we usually refer to it in these meetings. But here, I wanted to take the numbers just readily available to us and put it into a real picture to say, as an industry, we could give the electric system a 10% buffer, and we could credibly do it in the next 10 years. And if you do that, it's really transformative to all the ways we think about the electric system. And so what are those implications? Well, I think one of the biggest implications, if you have this, is you can have pretty much as much renewable as you'd like to have in that time period, right? We showed that we're only expecting to add another 28,000 megawatts over that time frame. So this, I think, is a vision. This is a vision that we at AES are working on in our storage team, and as other parts of the company. And we think it's going to start to happen in a meaningful way in the US and in other markets. We may see some smaller markets take a leap to this level of buffering on their systems. And there are many different numbers you can go look at on cost. I didn't want to take time to go into cost, but we are building these systems today. We've invested over $100 million in these systems. We're doing it commercially. These aren't demonstrations. They're not funded by the government for demonstration. These are commercial activities that we're doing. We think a lot more commercial activity can be done as the alternative to some of the other things that we're doing. So with that, I would say we have an opportunity for more power, less plant. That's the short form of the opportunity I think we all have in storage. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have any time. I'm willing to take questions if we do, but they didn't turn the timer.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes. I'm willing to take any questions if anyone has any questions or thoughts. And yeah.
What do you think the biggest threat is to the vision you have? Take us through that.
I think that's a great question. I think the biggest risk right now is that we as an industry and all the stakeholders in the industry don't realize some of these figures, right? So how much are we spending on assets that we don't use very often, right? And I think when people get an opportunity to look at that information, it usually does motivate them to think differently and maybe make some advances in how procurement is being done. That certainly has happened in California. That was part of the context of how California came to look at this and say, it looks like this is maturing, it's coming, there are all these instances of it performing and doing great work. Let's start to introduce it into the procurement cycle and see how it fares, right? It's a pretty safe thing to do because they said it has to be competitive. So if you keep it in the competitive context, it's not that big of a risk in the overall cost of the system, because in California the utilities are procuring and they have a determination to make as to whether that's the resource that meets their needs or not. And the thing that really does help that is the context. A lot of the needs that California has are hard to meet with 100% generation, right? You do need to convert fuel to electricity, right? So you need things like combined cycle power plants. We all need to get fuel into electricity, right? So we need some of those. We need probably a fair amount of those in California still. But you can't just keep adding power plants to deal with all of the renewable dynamics in markets like California. And so I won't go into that here, but people are recognizing that and saying, let's introduce storage because it has different resource characteristics. They're also introducing demand response and other technologies for that reason.